Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. I have over 13 years of experience in social work and another 5 years in therapy. In this video, I'm going to be talking about an aspect of the course that I'm offering online for free. This course is on scapegoat recovery in terms of supporting the person who's been through the scapegoating role within a dysfunctional family dynamic, as well as general advice around narcissistic abuse. I'll be covering one aspect of this course, one module. This module focuses primarily on what's considered the upper right in terms of the 4 quadrants. So the 4 quadrants is based off of integral theory in terms of the quadrants within that framework. And not to get too much involved with it, but basically the notion is that there's the exterior of reality and as well as the interior and also the collective. And so in this video, I'm highlighting primarily how this narcissistic abuse as well as scapegoating affects the, target or the victim in terms of more to do with their behavior or body, things you can measure and observe objectively in the exterior world. But I'll also be talking about a certain level of systems, so I'm taking a more collectivist approach, which would be considered the lower left and the lower right within the 4 quadrants. And with regards to that, I'll be covering the notion of the super self and just the way in which a dysfunctional or narcissistic family operates in terms of ensuring that there's a common narrative and that there's a certain control that occurs. So stay tuned as I'll be walking through different aspects of the 4 quadrant model, but particularly focusing on the upper right in terms of the physical reactions as well as what you can do to address some of this in terms of the body, and just ways to understand setting boundaries and staying more emotionally regulated in this dynamic. So stay tuned as I walk you through these core aspects of the 4 quadrant model. Mary Tulin and Dr. Ramsey talk about how trauma and the experience of having low-level or even high-level trauma that you experience throughout your life. There's this notion of a slow drip, subtle occurrences where the super self of the family feels threatened by the scapegoat or whoever might be speaking truth about what's occurring in the family, or simply being themselves. The super self experiences that as a threat to the equilibrium of the family dynamic. And so if you understand that, and then how in a lot of these families there's usually a lack of boundaries. When it comes to the body, obviously that's our first level of defense in terms of a boundary of the individual. And so a lot of times people have experiences where stress can get localized in the body. In Ken Wilber's quadrant theory, we've been talking about the other 3 quadrants, particularly with the upper left in terms of the inner experience of being on the receiving end of narcissistic abuse or emotional immaturity. And then we've been also talking about the different dynamics within the family system. So that's the lower right as well as the lower left in terms of the unspoken expectations and beliefs of the family and basically the collective interior. In this module, I'm just going to briefly talk about the upper right. So that is the quadrant in terms of the individual exterior, meaning that this is what you can observe or measure externally. When it comes to narcissistic abuse and emotional immaturity, you can think about how it gets experienced and there's a certain behavior within the individual. What kind of common things do you see and experience? And then in my work with clients, what do I normally see? And there's many different approaches to understanding exterior behaviors for a person who's been through this dynamic. I have recommended the book No More Mr. Nice Guy, as that's one example of behavior showing up later in life. That book doesn't necessarily say directly, but it talks about behavior where presentation of niceness, but in reality, he talks about how it's not always actually nice in a lot of ways. So that book talks about behaviors. And there's also Dr. Ramsey in terms of her book, It's Not You. She mentions common experiences of people who've been on the receiving end of narcissistic abuse. One of the core things in Mary Tulin's approach is the concept and understanding of how it gets localized in the body. So I've been walking through the upper right quadrant and the notion that in these families, often what is experienced is a lack of boundary and boundary crossing. And there's also the notion of emotional incest. What that really means is that in these families, sometimes the parents can be reliant on their children for their emotional support, whereas obviously we recognize adults shouldn't be having children in that role. It really should be the parents providing and taking care of the children. Often in some families there can be the notion of parentification of a child, where one parent turns to the child as a listening partner or almost like a therapist. When it comes to the body, there are many ways in which families interact. There's the notion of trauma localized in the body, and there are somatic approaches and exercises that focus on how trauma can be localized in the body. The upper right would be considered as the behaviors and experiences from the external. In these homes and families, sometimes it can be experienced in the gut or in the heart, especially in the notion of the scapegoating role. What we've been discussing is this notion of the super self of the family, and how when there's a threat to that equilibrium, the scapegoat or the truth teller in the family, or just their very authenticity and sharing their actual inner experience, their thoughts and their feelings from the upper left, then the family from the lower right, in terms of the super self, can see that as a threat, which they can use guilt and shame, gaslighting, like this didn't happen, or basically denying the reality of the scapegoat or the person who's pointing out the obvious. That's why in these families there can be certain cognitive dissonance and denial that occurs, as the scapegoat is told from a very early age that they have to deny truth of the collective self and the superego or the super self. Jerry Wise particularly talks about this concept. He's applying a family systems approach and family system therapy in regards to the notion of the super self. This ties in with Sam Vodkin's work in his book Narcissism Revisited. His perspective is that the narcissist has a false self, which plays into the persona or image they present to the outside world. The family can be a representation of this super self. Using Jerry Wise's work, there's this notion of the super self carrying the party line, so you have to align with a common narrative or a way of understanding one another and a common communication pattern. And it could be the narcissistic parents that ensure that remains in their control. And siblings can be used in this dynamic. The narcissist might use siblings to ensure that the super self remains in an equilibrium. Often it is very subtle, and it can be these constant trips over time. This notion of complex trauma. There's no smoking gun, no direct evidence, especially if the scapegoat is denied and not seen. And so at a very fundamental level, that scapegoat can internalize that, and it's hard for the self to not doubt itself, especially when the whole family can be in opposition or against the truth or what the inner experience is. This can be very deeply confusing for the scapegoat, as they might communicate their inner world. The thoughts and feelings of the upper left are not in alignment with the narrative of the family system in terms of the persona and the way in which the narcissistic parent or parents want to ensure that there's a common narrative. It remains the status quo of the family dynamic, right? And so this is just different ways to understand how in the upper right, how the body, so you can take certain books like The Body Keeps the Score and other somatic approaches in terms of understanding how trauma from childhood can get localized. We could be also understanding the three brains of the psyche or the self. Sometimes I'll bring this up with clients in terms of the three brains: the gut, the heart, and the head. The heart being your emotions, your head being your intellect, and your gut being your intuition or your subconscious. And so growing up, you're told at a very fundamental level what is abnormal. Jerry Wise talks about a reverse, where what's abnormal is supposed to be normal and vice versa. This can internalize and affect the body, where from a young age you're fundamentally told to deny your reality. There's a lot of gaslighting. So these individuals can at times be out of sync with their body and maybe their gut in terms of having gut issues. They could have issues with their heart in terms of threat to the super self, like the family or the persona that the narcissists want to present to the world. And so when the scapegoat or the truth teller is being authentic, that can be seen as a threat. There can be subtle put downs to ensure that communication remains within the grasp of the super self of the family. The thoughts and feelings of the individual, especially as they mature, can come to terms with how it's not always consistent, or they speak up in terms of an incident that occurs and there will be bad behavior. The family, the super self, doesn't want to perhaps change, or there's a common understanding that this is the way things go. And this can go back throughout generations. And so this is tied up in the psyche and the emotional and can be very raw and real for a lot of individuals. So that's why this goes deep into the self and to the different generations. There can be a collective trauma that passes on throughout the generations. You can also go into another layer in terms of understanding culture and how throughout time a lot of things had to be denied. So there was a suppression. It's only recently that through psychology and the notion of depth psychology, the subconscious, and other approaches within the different fields in terms of behavior, evolutionary biology, and psychology have come more to terms with the notion of the subconscious and how this can get localized in the body. In the later parts of the course, I'm going to be going into some practices to address or treat the body and how trauma can get released. There are different resources and books I've come across. My own approaches to understand both from a gross physical level in terms of the body, your fascia, and also considering the subtle body. And so subtle body is often your emotions, dreams, and subconscious mind. And so there's also subtle energy. You can consider how family origin issues can be reflected in the body. Jerry Wise talks about the super self, and that would be considered the lower left. His understanding of the super self is the notion that in the family there is this collective ego that needs to maintain its equilibrium. Growing up, the kids, when it comes to narcissistic parents, can be a reflection or lack of boundaries. Parents usually see their kids as an extension of themselves, and it'll be hard sometimes, especially for parents that are emotionally immature or narcissistic, to allow for healthy differentiation of self. As you get older, and I've seen it in many of my clients, lack of differentiation is definitely an occurrence that can happen on many occasions. Often when I'm working with couples or individuals, a lot of the framework can help understand how trauma can occur in a sense of relationship trauma. Jerry Wise talks about the super self and how there needs to be a homeostasis of the system. Jay Reid's book about scapegoating talks about defiance of narcissistic parents. Narcissistic parents often have underlying rules or ways of acting they want you to live by. I work with a lot of my clients on setting clear boundaries, setting healthy boundaries, taking care of your body, getting good sleep, and exercising can help a lot overcome a lot of the energetic and physical challenges that perhaps can be coming up due to your experience in your childhood or simply when you're around family. This can cause your body or your mind to be activated. Mary Tulin, in her approach in her videos, talks about how these limited beliefs of the self from a young age can get localized in the body. So it's not simply a cognitive exercise. You can go to talk therapy or do psychoanalysis or psychodynamic, but it's also good to understand and appreciate, especially if you take Mary Tulin's perspective, how these limited beliefs, these schemas or earlier beliefs of the self, right, based on your family of origin, and because of some perceptions of the self distorted from a young age, you have to, I think, figure out what are these limited beliefs that you might have, and then do exercises and approaches to help you let go and learn that you no longer need these beliefs to function. That's a journey and one way to approach it. A lot of times these things can be subconscious. It goes into Lindsay Gibson's work and a lot of theory in terms of emotionally focused therapy and modalities, particularly Gottman. Gottman talks about the importance of emotions, particularly when working with couples. And these core emotions he talks about anger, sadness, joy, fear, and pride. and how these different emotions shape how the couple responds to each other, especially when those emotions come up in arguments or gridlock issues. There's a lot of people that are more headstrong, and it's important to have insight and an analytical approach in terms of analyzing what occurred to you growing up. I think that's part of the journey. And in Ken Wilber's approach, he talks about how the intellect is always the first in terms of whenever you're developing or growing as an individual, you're first going to intellectually understand something before you somatically experience it or embody it. Intellectually, you're coming to a lot of this understanding, and it's good to know theory and do your research in terms of understanding the different dynamics and having an intellectual map to understand that, and that's largely what this course is about. But it's just a good reminder that somatically and emotionally, as well as subconsciously, your body is probably holding on to this past, and so it goes very deep into the notion of energy and ways in which the psyche can get localized in the body. I obviously take a more therapeutic approach in terms of understanding the mind and emotions. I also just know the importance of body work, even if it means exercise, yoga, cardio. I will leave some resources in the video below, some top recommendations when it comes to body exercise books, the latest research, and some books that I like on understanding health, nutrition, physical health, and longevity.